When negative thoughts try to rise up in your mind, when fear, worry, and heaviness knock at the door of your heart, know this: you are not alone, and you are not powerless. This morning, before the noise of the world speaks into your spirit, God is inviting you to pause, to breathe, and to come under His peace. Right now, whatever thoughts have been attacking your mind, doubt, anxiety, confusion, or discouragement, that do not have the final word. Today is not controlled by yesterday's failures or tomorrow's fears. Today belongs to God. And as we begin this morning prayer together, we choose to shift our focus from the chaos around us to the calm presence of the Lord within us. This is a moment to release every negative thought that has been weighing you down and to receive the peace that only God can give, a peace that guards your heart and your mind. So wherever you are, take a deep breath, open your heart, and prepare yourself, because as we speak this prayer, God's peace will begin to settle over your mind, silence every anxious voice, and fill you with hope for this new day. Negative thoughts do not define you, no matter how loud, persistent, or convincing they may feel in the moment. Many people believe that because a thought appears in their mind, it must be true, personal, or permanent. But that is not how the human mind or the spiritual life works. Thoughts can come from many places: past wounds, fear, exhaustion, outside pressure, or spiritual opposition, and their presence does not mean they reflect who you truly are. You are not your fears, you are not your doubts, and you are not the dark suggestions that pass through your mind during moments of weakness. A thought is something you experience, not something you become, and understanding this truth is the first step toward freedom and peace. Often, negative thinking tries to attach an identity to you. It whispers lies like "this is just who you are, you will never change," or "you always fail." But these statements are not facts, they are distortion. They take temporary emotions and turn them into permanent labels. When you begin to believe these labels, you start living under a false identity shaped by fear instead of truth. God never defines you by your worst thoughts or lowest moments. He sees you beyond mental noise, beyond emotional struggles, and beyond the attacks that come against your mind. Even when your thoughts feel messy and overwhelming, your value and purpose remain intact. Negative thoughts are often reactions, not revelation. They rise in response to stress, uncertainty, or pain, especially when you are tired or vulnerable. A worried thought may appear because you care deeply, not because you are weak. A fearful thought may surface because you are facing something unfamiliar, not because you lack faith. The problem begins when these thoughts are given authority, when they are allowed to speak louder than truth and shape how you see yourself and your future. Recognizing that a thought is simply a reaction allows you to step back and observe it without letting it rule you. Many people feel guilty for having negative thoughts, especially in faith-based settings. But guilt only strengthens the cycle. When you judge yourself for a thought, you give it more power and emotional weight. Instead of fighting your mind with shame, you can respond with awareness and grace. You can acknowledge the thought without accepting it, noticing it without agreeing with it. This gentle resistance weakens its influence and creates space for peace to enter. Freedom does not come from never having negative thoughts. It comes from not letting them define your identity or direction. Your true identity is rooted in something far deeper than mental patterns. Thoughts change from day to day, sometimes from hour to hour, but who you are remains constant. You are a person with worth, purpose, and the ability to grow, even on days when your mind feels heavy. When negative thoughts say you are broken, unworthy, or hopeless, they are speaking from a place of fear, not truth. Learning to separate who you are from what you think allows you to stand on solid ground instead of shifting emotions. Negative thoughts also lose their power when they are brought into the light. Silence often strengthens them, while awareness weakens them. When you realize that everyone experiences intrusive, discouraging, or fearful thoughts at times, you stop feeling isolated and defective. These thoughts are part of the human experience, not proof of failure. Even strong, faithful, and successful people have moments when their minds turn against them. What matters is not the presence of the thought, but the response to it. Choosing not to let negative thoughts define you is an act of courage. It means refusing to let your inner dialogue become your identity. It means understanding that your mind is a place where thoughts pass through, not a courtroom where every thought is a verdict. When a negative thought appears, you can say, "This is not who I am, and this does not control me." Over time, this mindset builds resilience and clarity, helping you respond with wisdom instead of fear. As you practice separating your identity from negative thinking, you begin to experience greater peace. You stop reacting to every mental attack and start responding with truth, patience, and trust. Your confidence no longer depends on having a perfect mind, but on knowing who you are beyond your thoughts, even when those thoughts try to pull you into doubt, confusion, or despair. God's peace is stronger than mental attacks, and this truth becomes especially important when the mind feels like a battlefield. Many people wake up in the morning already fighting thoughts they did not choose, thoughts of fear, self-doubt, regret, insecurity, and anxiety. These thoughts arrive quietly but aggressively, trying to control emotions, decisions, and even faith. Mental attacks often feel personal and overwhelming, as if they are a reflection of reality, but they are not. God's peace operates on a higher level than human emotion or logic, and it has the power to interrupt, overpower, and replace every negative thought that rises against the mind. Mental attacks usually begin with small whispers. A thought suggests that you are not enough, that something bad will happen, that your situation will never change, or that God is silent. If these thoughts are left unchecked, they grow louder and begin to shape how a person sees themselves and the world. This is why God's peace is not simply a feeling. It is a spiritual force. It does not depend on circumstances being perfect or problems disappearing. God's peace enters even when chaos is present, and it brings stability where instability once ruled. The peace of God works differently from human peace. Human peace is often temporary and conditional. It exists only when everything seems under control. The peace God gives remains even when life feels uncertain. When negative thoughts attack, they try to convince the mind that it must solve everything alone. God's peace reminds the heart that it is not alone and never has been. This peace guards the mind, standing like a shield between the believer and the lies that attempt to take root. Mental attacks often target identity. They question worth, purpose, and belonging. God's peace responds by restoring clarity. It brings the assurance that your value does not come from your performance, your past, or the opinions of others. When God's peace fills the mind, it becomes harder for negative thoughts to stay. They may still try to appear, but they lose their authority and influence. Peace creates a space where truth can be heard more clearly than fear. Another way God's peace proves stronger than mental attacks is through calmness in the middle of pressure. Negative thoughts usually rush the mind, creating urgency and panic. God's peace slows everything down. It allows the heart to breathe again. In that calm space, emotions begin to settle, and thoughts become easier to manage. This calm does not mean the problem is gone. It means the problem no longer controls the mind. Peace brings balance back to thoughts that were scattered and overwhelmed. God's peace also brings trust. Mental attacks thrive on uncertainty and fear of the unknown. Peace invites trust in God's presence and timing. When peace enters, it shifts focus away from worst-case scenarios and toward the faithfulness of God. It gently reminds the heart that God has carried you before and will carry you again. This trust weakens the power of negative thinking because fear loses its foundation. Prayer is often the doorway through which God's peace enters the mind. When a person prays honestly, releasing their worries instead of hiding them, peace begins to replace pressure. It may not happen instantly, but with sincere prayer, the mind gradually becomes lighter. God's peace does not argue with negative thoughts, it overcomes them. By filling the mind with a deeper awareness of God's nearness, where peace is present, mental attacks cannot dominate for long. God's peace also strengthens emotional resilience. Negative thoughts can make small problems feel unbearable. Peace restores perspective. It helps the mind see challenges as temporary rather than permanent. With peace, a person can face difficulties without being consumed by them. The situation may still be difficult, but the heart remains steady, and the mind remains anchored instead of drifting into despair. When God's peace is active in the mind, it creates a habit of responding instead of reacting. Mental attacks want immediate emotional reactions, but peace encourages thoughtful, faith-filled responses. This shift changes how a person handles stress, conflict, and disappointment. Instead of being driven by fear, the mind begins to move with wisdom and confidence. God's peace is not fragile. It does not break easily under pressure. Even when negative thoughts return, peace remains available. It can be renewed again and again through prayer, trust, and focusing the mind on God's truth. Over time, this peace trains the mind to recognize lies faster and hold on to truth longer, making each mental attack weaker than the last. Fear, worry, and anxiety often enter the human heart quietly, building over time until they feel overwhelming. They do not usually arrive all at once. Instead, they grow through unanswered questions, uncertain futures, painful memories, and situations beyond our control. When these emotions are carried alone, they drain peace, weaken faith, and cloud judgment. Releasing fear, worry, and anxiety to God is not a sign of weakness, but an act of deep spiritual strength, because it requires trust beyond human understanding. It is the conscious decision to acknowledge that God is greater than every troubling thought and more powerful than every circumstance that causes distress. To release these burdens to God begins with honesty. Many people try to hide their fears, even from God, pretending to be strong while their inner world is restless and heavy. God does not ask for perfection, He asks for sincerity. When a person brings their worries to God exactly as they are, without filters or pretenses, it opens the door for healing. Fear loses its grip when it is spoken in prayer, because darkness cannot survive where light is invited. Anxiety thrives in silence, but it weakens when surrendered to the presence of God. Worry is often rooted in the desire to control outcomes. The human mind constantly tries to solve tomorrow's problems today, replay yesterday's mistakes, or imagine worst-case scenarios. This mental cycle creates exhaustion and steals joy from the present moment. Releasing worry to God means letting go of the need to control everything and accepting that God already sees what we cannot. It is choosing to trust His wisdom over our limited understanding. When worry is placed in God's hands, the heart begins to rest. Not because every problem disappears instantly, but because the burden is no longer carried alone. Anxiety affects both the mind and the body. It tightens the chest, disrupts sleep, and fills thoughts with unease. Many people pray while still holding tightly to their anxiety, asking God for peace, but not truly releasing the cause of their distress. True release happens when a person intentionally hands over every anxious thought to God, again and again if necessary. This is not a one-time action, but a daily spiritual practice. Each time anxiety returns, it is met with prayer and surrender, reminding the soul that God is in control. Even when emotions feel unstable, trust plays a central role in releasing fear, worry, and anxiety. Trust does not mean understanding everything God is doing. It means believing in His character even when answers are delayed. When fear says something bad will happen, trust says God is still good. When worry says the future is uncertain, trust says God already holds tomorrow. When anxiety says peace is impossible, trust says God's peace goes beyond human logic. This trust shifts the focus from problems to God's presence, which is where true peace begins. Releasing emotional burdens to God also requires letting go of self-blame and guilt. Often fear and anxiety are fueled by past mistakes or feelings of inadequacy. People replay their failures and punish themselves mentally, believing they deserve stress or hardship. God does not operate this way. He offers grace, forgiveness, and renewal. When guilt is released to God, the heart becomes lighter, and the mind becomes clearer. Freedom begins when a person accepts that God's mercy is greater than their past. Prayer becomes a powerful exchange in this process. Fear, worry, and anxiety are given to God, and in return, peace, strength, and clarity are received. This exchange does not always change circumstances immediately, but it changes the inner response to those circumstances. A calm mind can think clearly. A peaceful heart can make wise decisions. A surrendered spirit can endure challenges without being crushed by them. Over time, this practice transforms how a person responds to stress, replacing panic with prayer and fear with faith. Releasing these burdens to God also strengthens spiritual awareness. It teaches the heart to recognize when negative thoughts are rising, and to respond quickly with surrender instead of resistance. Rather than fighting anxiety alone, the soul learns to turn toward God as a refuge. This deepens the relationship with Him and builds confidence that no emotional weight is too heavy for Him to carry. Fear no longer dominates the mind, worry no longer dictates choices, and anxiety no longer controls peace. Renewing your mind through prayer means allowing God to reshape the way you think, respond, and see yourself and your circumstances. Every day, our minds are exposed to countless voices: fear, doubt, negativity, past failures, and future worries. These thoughts do not appear suddenly. They build slowly, repeating themselves until they feel like truth. Prayer is the spiritual space where these false patterns are confronted and replaced with God's truth. When you pray, you are not just speaking words, you are opening your mind to divine influence, inviting God to interrupt unhealthy thought cycles and restore clarity and peace. Negative thinking often begins quietly. A single worry turns into constant anxiety, a small mistake turns into self-condemnation, and one delay turns into hopelessness. Over time, the mind becomes tired, heavy, and defensive. Prayer creates a pause in that mental noise. It pulls your attention away from what is overwhelming you and redirects it toward the presence of God. In prayer, you slow down long enough to recognize which thoughts are not from God and which ones need to be surrendered. This awareness is the first step in renewing the mind, because you cannot change what you do not notice. When you pray consistently, your inner dialogue begins to change. Instead of rehearsing fear, you begin to repeat God's promises. Instead of assuming the worst, you begin to expect His guidance. Prayer trains your mind to respond differently to pressure. Problems may still exist, but your thinking about them shifts. You stop asking, "What if everything goes wrong?" and start asking, Where is God leading me through this? This shift does not happen overnight, but each prayer weakens the grip of negative thoughts and strengthens faith-filled thinking. Renewing the mind through prayer also means allowing God to heal emotional wounds that influence your thoughts. Many negative thinking patterns are rooted in past experiences, rejection, loss, failure, or disappointment. These memories often resurface as lies about your worth, your future, or your ability to succeed. Prayer brings these hidden wounds into God's light. As you speak honestly to Him, He begins to replace shame with grace, fear with assurance, and confusion with wisdom. Over time, the mind learns that it is safe to let go of old narratives and accept new ones shaped by God's truth. Prayer does not eliminate thoughts, it filters them. Your mind will always be active, but prayer helps you discern which thoughts deserve your attention. When you pray, you align your thinking with God's perspective rather than your emotion. Feelings are real, but they are not always accurate. Prayer allows truth to lead instead of fear. It reminds you that you are guided, protected, and sustained by God, even when circumstances suggest otherwise. This alignment brings mental stability and inner peace that cannot be produced by positive thinking alone. Another powerful aspect of renewing the mind through prayer is repetition. Just as negative thoughts grow stronger through repetition, so do positive, faith-filled thoughts. When you pray daily, you repeat. Daily expose your mind to God's truth. Over time, your mind begins to default to peace instead of panic, trust instead of worry, and hope instead of despair. Prayer becomes a mental habit that reshapes how you process life. Challenges no longer feel like threats, but opportunities to rely more deeply on God's strength. Prayer also invites God's presence into the mind, and where His presence dwells, chaos loses control. Many people try to fight negative thoughts with willpower alone, but prayer brings divine help into the battle. You are no longer carrying mental burdens by yourself. As you pray, God strengthens your inner man, giving you the ability to resist destructive thinking and embrace thoughts that bring life. This is not about denying reality, but about viewing reality through the lens of faith. As your mind is renewed through prayer, peace becomes more than a feeling. It becomes a mindset. You begin to approach each day with calm confidence, knowing that God is involved in every detail of your life. Even when negative thoughts attempt to return, they no longer dominate because your mind has learned a new way of thinking. A way that is anchored in prayer, shaped by trust, and guided by God's truth rather than fear or uncertainty. Choosing faith over negative thinking is a daily, intentional decision that begins in the mind and is strengthened in the heart. Negative thoughts often arrive quietly, disguised as logic, past experiences, or self-protection, but faith calls us to see beyond what we feel and focus on what God has promised. Faith does not deny reality. Instead, it reframes reality through the truth of God's word. When negative thinking tells you that you are weak, faith reminds you that God's strength is made perfect in weakness. When your mind repeats thoughts of failure, faith rises up to declare that with God, all things are possible. This choice is not automatic. It is a spiritual act of resistance against thoughts that seek to steal your peace and joy. Negative thinking often feeds on fear, uncertainty, and past pain. It pulls the mind into a cycle of overthinking, regret, and worry about the future. Faith interrupts this cycle by anchoring the mind in hope. To choose faith is to trust God, even when answers are not clear and outcomes are unknown. It means believing that God is working behind the scenes, even when circumstances suggest otherwise. Faith shifts your attention from what could go wrong to who God is and what He can do. This shift does not happen once. It must be practiced repeatedly, especially when negative thoughts try to take control. Choosing faith requires guarding what enters your mind. The thoughts you allow to stay will eventually shape your emotions, decisions, and action. Faith invites you to challenge negative thoughts instead of accepting them as truth. When a thought tells you that you are alone, faith responds by remembering that God has promised never to leave or forsake you. When your mind says the situation is hopeless, faith declares that nothing is too hard for the Lord. This inner dialogue is where spiritual battles are often won or lost. Faith speaks louder when it is fed through prayer, scripture, and trust in God's character. Faith also brings peace because it releases the burden of control. Negative thinking thrives when you try to manage everything on your own. Faith, however, invites you to surrender outcomes to God. This surrender does not mean giving up. It means trusting that God's plans are higher and wiser than your own. When you choose faith, you stop carrying weights that were never meant for you to hold. Your mind begins to rest, not because problems disappear, but because you know you are held by a faithful God. This trust calms anxiety and weakens the power of negative thoughts over time. Another powerful aspect of choosing faith is learning to see yourself through God's eyes rather than through the lens of past mistakes or present struggles. Negative thinking often distorts identity, convincing you that you are defined by failures, limitations, or opinions of others. Faith restores identity by reminding you that you are loved, chosen, and valued by God. When you believe this truth, negative thoughts lose their authority. Faith strengthens confidence, not in self alone, but in God who works through you. This confidence changes how you face challenges and how you speak to yourself during difficult moments. Faith also grows stronger through consistency. The more you choose faith over negative thinking, the easier it becomes to recognize lies and replace them with truth. This does not mean you will never experience negative thoughts again, but it does mean they will no longer control you. Faith trains the mind to pause, pray, and realign with God instead of reacting out of fear. Over time, this practice reshapes mental habits and creates a more peaceful inner environment. Faith becomes a lens through which you interpret life, rather than negativity shaping your perspective. Ultimately, choosing faith is an act of obedience and trust. It is deciding to believe God's word above your emotions and circumstances. It is choosing hope when despair feels more natural and peace when anxiety tries to dominate. Faith does not remove every challenge, but it empowers you to face them with courage and calm. As faith becomes your default response, negative thinking loses its grip, and your mind becomes a place where God's peace can dwell freely, guiding your thoughts, strengthening your heart, and shaping your outlook. Each day, as you continue to trust Him even when the journey feels uncertain and the answers seem delayed and the path ahead requires patience and surrender. Starting the day covered in God's peace means choosing, from the very first moments of waking, to place your mind, heart, and emotions under His presence rather than under pressure. Morning is a spiritual gateway. Whatever fills your thoughts early often shapes your attitude, reactions, and decisions for the rest of the day. When the mind wakes up, it is especially sensitive, and negative thoughts often try to attack at this time, reminding you of unfinished problems, past failures, fears about the future, or worries you cannot control. Covering your day in God's peace is an intentional act of faith, where you decide that anxiety will not be the first voice you listen to and fear will not be the first guide you follow. Instead, you invite God to rule over your thoughts before the world has a chance to influence them. God's peace is not the absence of problems, but the presence of His authority in your inner life. When you begin the day with prayer, you are spiritually declaring that your mind belongs to God. This creates a protective covering over your thoughts, like a shield that guards you against emotional turbulence and mental exhaustion. Peace from God stabilizes you. It slows down racing thoughts, quiets inner noise, and reminds you that you are held, seen, and supported. Even if challenges come later in the day, they meet a heart that is already anchored rather than shaken. This peace does not depend on circumstances changing. It depends on trust, being placed in God before circumstances even appear. Covering your day in God's peace also means surrendering control. Many negative thoughts are born from the illusion that you must handle everything alone. Worry often feels productive, but in reality, it drains strength and steals joy. When you pray in the morning, you are saying that your day does not rest on your own ability, but on God's wisdom and power. This surrender brings relief. It allows your mind to rest, knowing that whatever you cannot control, God already holds. Peace flows naturally when the burden of control is released and trust takes its place. Another powerful aspect of starting the day in peace is alignment. Prayer aligns your thoughts with truth. The mind is constantly forming narratives, and without guidance, it often leans toward negativity, self-doubt, and fear. Morning prayer realigns your thinking with God's promises rather than your emotions. It reminds you of who God is and who you are in Him. This alignment shapes how you interpret situations throughout the day. Instead of reacting with panic, you respond with calm. Instead of assuming the worst, you expect God's guidance. Peace becomes a lens through which you view every interaction and challenge. Starting the day covered in God's peace also strengthens emotional resilience. Life does not stop being demanding simply because you prayed, but prayer prepares you to face demands with grace. Peace gives you space between stimulus and response. It helps you pause instead of react, reflect instead of explode, and listen instead of rushing to judgment. This inner calm protects relationships, improves decision-making, and preserves emotional energy. When peace governs your heart, negativity loses its power to control your mood and behavior. This daily covering is not a one-time experience, but a consistent practice. Peace deepens with repetition. Each morning you choose prayer over panic, trust over tension, and faith over fear. Your mind becomes trained to rest in God more quickly. Over time, Negative thoughts find less room to settle because peace has already occupied that space. Your spirit becomes familiar with calm, and anxiety no longer feels like the default state. Peace becomes your normal response rather than a rare moment. Start the day in God's peace also impacts your spiritual sensitivity. When the mind is calm, it becomes easier to hear God's guidance. Peace clears mental clutter and allows discernment to grow. You begin to sense when to speak, when to wait, when to move, and when to rest. This clarity protects you from impulsive decisions driven by fear or pressure. Peace becomes a quiet confidence that guides you through the day, even when answers are not immediately visible. Covering your day in God's peace is ultimately an act of hope. It is choosing to believe that this day, regardless of what it holds, is already known to God and already within His care. It is trusting that you do not walk into the day alone, unprotected or unprepared. Peace becomes the foundation on which the rest of the day is built, influencing your thoughts, words, and actions as you move forward, trusting that God's presence goes before you and remains with you as every moment of the day unfolds.